All right. All right, everybody, we are live on Facebook. We are ready to go. Thank you so much for being here as we talk about womanist ethical rhetoric. And I would like to welcome our contributors today, Dr. Camille Anderson, Dr. Cerise Glenn, Dr. Kimberly Johnson, Dr. Michelle Meggs, Dr. Andre Johnson, Natanya. ABD? Yes, our future
so close,
Dr.
so close.
Natanya Blackman, the Stitch. Thank you so much. And we're going to get, I want to get started right away because we have so much information to cover as we talk about womanist ethical rhetoric, a call for liberation and social justice in turbulent times. And this work, this scholarship is more than just that. This is a culmination of intellectual thought and community activism. And so it is dynamic, it's moving, it's growing, and things have changed so much from when we started this project through publication through today. So I am going to introduce you to Dr. Kimberly P. Johnson. Dr. Johnson is an associate professor of communication and women's studies at Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee. She brings to the Department of Communication her areas of specialization: political, religious, and African-American rhetoric, rhetorical criticism, cultural criticism, and womanism. Dr. Johnson teaches the senior project capstone course, Communication Research Methods, honors public speaking, fundamentals of communication, public speaking, persuasion, African-American rhetoric, and introduction to women's studies to undergraduate students. Dr. Johnson has presented her research at professional communication associations, such as the National Communication Association, Rhetoric Society of America, Southern States Communication Association, and the Tennessee Communication Association. She is the author of, if you don't have your copy, you should get one, The Womanist Preacher, Proclaiming Womanist Rhetoric from the Pulpit. And I am so excited that she contributed her thoughts, her ideas, and her activism to the womanist ethical rhetoric. Dr. Kimberly P. Johnson.
Thank you so much. And I'm so honored to be a part of this wonderful book project. Okay, so the title of my chapter is called A Womanist Response to Black Lives Matter and American Nationalism. This chapter uses a womanist lens to critique the Black Lives Matter movement, along with its engagement in anti-respectability politics. It reveals some of the womanist ideologies that are innate to the Black Lives Matter movement and details the womanist support for the movement. In addition, this project investigates how womanists are confronting American nationalism. I specifically analyzed Tracy Blackman's speech, If These Walls Could Talk, delivered on January 21st, 2019 at the St. Louis History Museum. In order to talk about Black Lives Matter, we must first talk about the exigency which initiated the need for a Black Lives Matter movement. On February 26, 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was walking home from the store with a bag of Skittles and a can of iced tea to the retreated Twins Lake gated community in Sanford, Florida, when the neighborhood watch captain, George Zimmerman, reported him as a suspicious person to the police. Zimmerman ignored police instructions to stay in his SUV and instead initiated a verbal and physical exchange with Trayvon Martin that resulted in him firing his gun and killing Trayvon, which he claimed to be an act of self-defense. On April 11, 2012, Zimmerman was charged with second-degree murder. By July 13, 2013, Zimmerman was found not guilty. And on February 24th, 2015, the U.S. Justice Department announced that no federal civil rights charges would be brought against Zimmerman, resulting in another vigilante death on a Black body that has gone unpunished. Kelly Brown Douglas argues Black victims of fatal violence are presumed guilty of bringing their deaths upon themselves. And Ursula Orr suggests there is no justice for people already presumed to be disposable. Trayvon's death was the catalyst that prompted 3 radical Black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, to launch the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. This movement is rooted in the experiences of Black people who actively resist dehumanization. They claim that Black Lives Matter is an ideological and political intervention in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. It is an affirmation of Black folks' humanity, our contributions to this society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. The Black Lives Matter organization works to end state-sanctioned violence against Black people and to end vigilante violence inflicted on Black communities. Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black, queer, and transgender individuals, the disabled, the undocumented, individuals with criminal records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. It aims to center those who have been marginalized within the Black liberation movements. While the Black Lives Matter organization continues to fight for justice, it still faces backlash. The Black Lives Matter movement has received the same type of criticism that was said about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. SNCC was criticized for operating autonomously and not having one specific leader. Similarly, the Black Lives Matter organizational pattern is more of a group-centered organization rather than a leader-centered group pattern. However, the main critique of Black Lives Matter is that the church did not start it. It is not a Black church initiative because it didn't start in the church. It started in the streets. The methodological approaches of Black Lives Matter have even been called into question for rejecting proven methods of the civil rights movement. Black Lives Matter has been criticized for lacking a nonviolent approach and for engaging in anti-respectability politics. Evelyn Higginbotham, there we go, is the one who developed the term politics of respectability. The discourse emphasized manners and morals while simultaneously asserting traditional forms of protest such as petitions, boycotts, and verbal appeals to justice. Alyssa V. Richardson argues that the aim of respectability politics was to be a living contradiction to the crude stereotypes of Black women as it sought to develop counter discourses of Blackness. Richardson claims anti-respectability as an approach to political communication picks up where womanist movements of the mid-1970s left off, with intentionally radical performances of self and strong promises to value the most vulnerable Black lives. Anti-respectability asks that one brings their intersectional identity to the protest. Anti-respectability politics does not require one to have to fit into any preconceived box because individuals are invited to bring their whole selves to the Black Lives Matter movement, and women are not required or expected to take a back seat to leadership. When we look at some of the womanists who are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, we see a lot of support from womanist scholars and practitioners. When Brittany Cooper looks beyond respectability, she sees an embodied discourse. Embodied discourse refers to a form of Black female textual activism, wherein race women assertively demand the inclusion of their bodies, and in particular, working class bodies and Black female bodies, by placing them in the texts they write and speak. Embodied discourse disrupts the politics of respectability as the paradigmatic frames through which to engage Black women's ideas and their politics. Women are using their voices and their bodies to navigate the public sphere. Embodied discourse invites womanist activists to center their own experiences and to allow those representations of self to shape their activism. Pamela Lightsey explained the disconnect. There we go. Now you can see the slide. She explained the disconnect between Black Lives Matter and the older civil rights cohort. She said Black lives activists respect the leader of another day, but they are not going to bow down. They can't come into a protest march and demand a front seat or jump to the front of the lines when the cameras are on. The movement is not a Black church initiative. Lightsey also clarified why Black Lives Matter does not subscribe to receiving orders from the typical heterosexual Black male who sits at the top of the civil rights hierarchical model. Black Lives Matter intentionally focuses on the needs of Black queers, the Black transgendered, the Black undocumented, Black incarcerated, and others who are hardly a speck on today's political agenda. Rosalind Satchel, an organizer of Black Lives Matter, says that some Black Lives Matter activists will tell you unapologetically that they committed their lives to the Black liberation struggle, adopting a womanist Black nationalist framework with a queer and trans lens. Leah Gunning-Francis's womanist response to Ferguson and Black Lives Matter is to document the lived experiences of the people and to show how different faiths can come together to support a social justice movement birthed out of tragedy. Tracy Blackman's response to Ferguson is to go to the Canfield Green Apartments, coordinate a clergy police station meeting, host community forums, and to fight for social justice alongside Black Lives Matter. Now that we have uncovered the womanist critique of Black Lives Matter, we must turn to Tracy Blackman to discover a womanist critique of American nationalism. Blackman serves as the Executive Minister of Justice and Witness of the United Church of Christ denomination, and she is the former pastor of Christ the King Church in Florissant, Missouri. In her speech, If These Walls Could Talk, she delivered in honor of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday at the St. Louis History Museum, she says, history has proven time and time again that humanity's insatiable thirst for freedom is so strong that people will risk their lives to quench it, no matter what the barriers may be. And there is no wall, neither physical or otherwise, strong enough or high enough or entrenched enough to stop those who seek freedom. Blackman's speech is saturated with quotes from Martin Luther King Jr., and she argues that the words from King's speech, East or West, God's children, are eerily haunting, and then lifts up the fact that his speech reminds us that our destiny binds us together in common humanity, common history, common calling, and common hope for the salvation of the world. Blackman defines her walls metaphor by pointing out that she's really talking about the present day divisiveness at the US-Mexican border and Trump's political game to use federal workers as pawns in the scheme to shut down the government over funding for a border wall. She notes that we are more concerned with winning and less concerned with our humanity. Blackman questions what King might say about today's State of the Union and the failure to build bridges across political divisions. Her answer is that America is in trouble. Blackman challenges her audience to emulate his courage and conscience in the face of empire. She reminds them that King advocated for tearing down all walls, all forms of barriers, both metaphorical and literal. Blackman critiques the current state of affairs by saying that the United States' lack of concern centers around its need to maintain American nationalism. She reminds her audience that King even admonished his listeners to transcend the narrow confines of nationalism in his 1953 sermon titled False Gods We Worship. Blackman argues that nationalism cannot create community. Blackman claims that King's radical revolution of values emphasizes love and justice instead of economic nationalism. And Blackman lifts up King's confession that his conscience left him no other choice but to break the betrayal of his silence on the US involvement in the Vietnam War, to highlight the fact that we need to let our conscience convict us so that we too will speak truth to the powers of fear and hatred. She inquires as to how we become a nation driven by fear as opposed to faith. And she points us to the Bible, Ephesians 2:4. And she argues that Paul reminds us that our divisions are not greater than our God. She identifies the walls we created, walls of indifference that prevent us from allowing Mexican migrants to seek asylum in the US, walls of educational inequity that guarantee a substandard education to the poorest students, walls of religious intolerance that make us believe the myth of the Christian nation, that America is a Christian nation consistently guided by Christian values. Walls of unjust legal systems that deny access to free labor, and walls of unjust legal systems that function like Jim Crow, and walls of inefficiency within political parties that cause our elected officials to forget their oath to serve all people. Trump did not need political experience to get to the White House as long as he could deliver on his campaign promise of white dominance and control. Blackman challenges us to examine our personal walls and to tear down our personal walls. The plan she proposes is to build bridges of access to resources to fix our failing school systems, bridges of access to excellent and affordable health care, bridges to citizenship that honor the contributions of all humanity, bridges to living wages for honorable work, bridges to responsible criminal justice reform that reduces recidivism and promotes rehabilitation. Blackman's plan is geared toward the wholeness and well-being of all humanity. Blackman says we cannot allow fear to drive us to abandon a solidified front that demands equity for all of God's creation. In times of great fear and trepidation, we must resist the urge of self-preservation and boldly declare justice can never be about just us. In her closing remarks, we finally discover what the walls would say if they could talk. Blackman proclaims, I believe they would say, history proves this true. No wall built to divide us will ever stand the test of time. From Jericho to Berlin to our southern borders, the walls must come down because on both sides of every wall, God's children are present. Thank you.
We have our wonderful co-editor, Dr. Cerise L. Glenn. Dr. Glenn is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She has also served as the director of the African American and African Diaspora Studies program. One of her research interests centers on the professional and social identity of underrepresented groups, and she mentors diverse groups in higher education with intersectional perspectives. She also examines how African American women negotiate their identities utilizing Black feminist and womanist thought. Currently, she is the principal investigator on a $1 million multi-year National Science Foundation advance grant, which strengthens organizational practices to recruit and retain women faculty in the STEM fields. It is my honor to present to you right now, Dr. Cerise L. Glenn.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Gaddison. Also, thank you for having me join you as a co-editor on this book project. It's been great to see how all of our different chapters connect to each other on such an important topic. Before I get into the aims of my chapter, which will connect to some of the themes that Dr. Johnson spoke about, I want to talk about the connections between womanism and Black feminist thought. Dr. Malagas and I were going to talk earlier, and we were talking through some of how we're taught in scholarship, particularly in communication studies. And it's present in other social sciences as well, that you got to have your theoretical terrain. Like, what's your little silo? Where do you stay? And one of the great aspects of being able to work on this book and work with the scholars that are also joining me tonight is to see how we pull from those different areas to talk about a common theme. So one is womanism. And womanism is credited to Alice Walker as coining the term, and she defines it as a Black feminist or feminist of color. From the Black folk expression of mothers to female children, you acting womanish, like you're woman, usually too far ahead of where you should be. Usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior. So what I wanted to do in this chapter is situate womanism within what it shares with Black feminist thoughts. You probably heard that expression, womanism is the Black feminist thought, like lavender is the purple. So to see them as interconnected frames that stand in conversation to each other, but that highlight different aspects of women of color's experiences in different ways. So one of the ways that those have in common, I'm gonna pull out four: intersectionality. We look at how we examine the lived experiences of Black women and other women of color, not through by trying to understand the issues of African Americans or women and then say, hey, they fall somewhere in there. Because oftentimes, if you're talking about women's rights, that discourse can be dominated by white women, and the advancements can be towards white women in ways that women of color don't necessarily connect, particularly when you look at other aspects of who we are, which is culturally, communalism may be different, socioeconomic status may be different, and in predominantly African-American spaces, there often may be discourses of sexism that aren't caught right to the attention. And so when you have different ways of advancing Black women's voices and other women of color, voices can fall left to the center or right to the center, so to speak. Holism. Womanism gives us this nice frame, along with aspects of Black feminist thought, to bring our whole selves to the table. We don't have to just see ourselves through the eyes of others and through these fragmented ways. Like, we don't have to be, okay, everybody's Black and here's Black woman is a small piece of Blackness. Or here's womanhood and here's how Black womanhood is a small piece that compares to white womanhood. And looking at the different beautiful ways that make us who we are, spiritual identities, socioeconomic identities, our familial identities, that we are whole human people, not marginalized discourses or stereotypes or tropes. One of the ways we push back against those tropes or those marginalizing discourses is through the power of self-definition. So there's this tension there where we don't necessarily have to accept everything the world throws at us. We have the sense of agency and what's next empowerment to push back and to define ourselves on our own terms. So the show, Examining Grace Greenleaf, Black Women's Activism and Spirituality, is my chapter. And you have an image that's from the Oprah Winfrey Network own website. And the person standing in the front center is Grace Greenleaf, who is the lead protagonist of the show. And behind her are her parents, Lady May and Bishop, who Bishop he runs the mega church, and Lady May is the first lady of the church. They're a married couple and her parents. The show Greenleaf ran from 2016 to 2020 on the Oprah Winfrey Network. It also airs on Netflix. It starts off with the premise of Grace Greenleaf being away for several years and returning home when her sister passes away. All members of the family occupy important roles at Calvary, so her other two siblings also are an active part of the church. As the series progressed, you watch the family negotiate different tensions, both within their familial spaces, but I'll be primarily talking about the representations of Black womanhood as it's negotiated in institutionalized professional spaces. And oftentimes when I do organizational work, I like to pull from popular culture and media because the images people get of us often come from those spaces, and how women enact a professional identity through the different aspects and different representations we get, along with institutions such as churches and occupations. In her role, she is the associate pastor. So I'll talk through 4 themes overview for you this evening as we analyze Grace Greenleaf's character. The first is Black women in love and in trouble, the need for safe spaces. In Alice Walker's work, she talks about this notion of in love and in trouble, primarily problematizing romantic and familial relationships for African American women who were in heteronormative relationships. That she argues that we're brought up with messages, we're socialized to believe that institutions such as church and marriage are to be safe spaces for us, and we should seek out these spaces to shelter us from other aspects of racism and other marginalizing discourses we may have. What this show helps problematize is how safe are those safe spaces. So one of Grace Greenleaf's initiatives when she starts the role of associate pastor is to start a group for Sisters of Tamar, which is a group for Black women or all women in the church who are in abusive relationships, whether they be romantic or otherwise. So one of the characters, Stacy, she encourages her to leave her abusive situation. She's married with children. She does get her to flee the situation temporarily, but her husband has a really bad backlash because he feels like he's being put out there, so to speak, or airing the dirty laundry. He doesn't want people to know what's going on in their home. So in a conversation with Grace and Stacy, Stacy explains to her that even though she's in an abusive relationship, she thinks it's more acceptable and better for her and her kids to stay in that environment because she really wants her kids to have a dad and to be in a nuclear space, despite the fact that that space is not safe for her or her children. The next theme is Black women's social justice, the politics of respectability of silence. Scholars will argue that the politics of respectability in churches, at times, as Cheney describes, males can use their positions of power to sometimes silence people who don't have as much power. I know another chapter will go into the role of women as far as the role of minister, so I won't go too much into that. But part of what women are socialized is that as they take on roles of leadership, their roles of leadership are there to support Black male leaders, not to enact their own leadership. And the politics of respectability may socialize them that they are to find someone who is God-fearing and who will respect them, which means they need to be conservative in a way and be silenced. That old adage of women are to be seen and not heard. What Grace does and other female characters is challenge that older notion of politics of respectability and how some men will try to use that to silence women. For example, she talks through how with Coralie, who's another character who kills her husband in self-defense, and through other examples, her Uncle Mac, who abuses women, pretty much young girls in the story, that instead of hiding behind the institutions of respectability to silence women, that she uses that to actually have him incarcerated. I won't spoil the whole storyline for you. I feel like I'm giving you enough spoilers, but the show, it does end with him not staying in that position. So she is able to take him out of a position of power, but she does that through breaking silence. In intergroup dynamics, tensions of support and divisiveness, Dr. Johnson eloquently spoke through some tensions of Black Lives Matter and connections to the church. One of the things that happens early on in the series, particularly in the first season, is a reaction of what should we do when a Black male officer, whose name is Nelson, David Nelson, who's part of the church, accidentally shoots and kills a young teenage Black male. So oftentimes we see Black Lives Matter is framed as a power of white versus Black or police versus community without complicating or interrogating that issue. So what starts to happen is this dissension among what are they going to do or how are they going to respond. And I should note that this season predates 2020. So it aired earlier on. So I think it has a newer meaning as we think about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and more contemporary, this newer, use the term like awakening or more moments of people coming back to Black Lives Matter or adding more vigor to what the group stands for and for activism and social justice. As they do that, the bishop actually decides to not get involved in any rallies. He does not want to talk to David Nelson. He does not take his phone calls. He does not want to support or counsel him. He decides to back what is called a Back the Blue Day, where he has mostly white officers and the white mayor attend a church service. This becomes quite disruptive as the deacons board and other members of the church do not approve of this move. So they actually walk out on his sermon when they have the Back the Blue Day. The rival church in this series actually does host rallies and speaks to what they would call the civil area of street protests and Black Lives Matter. So you see that tension and how does one fight this fight. Grace Greenleaf actually goes against her father's wishes and she does reach out to counsel David Nelson. She sees that as part of her calling as an associate pastor. She does so behind his back. When she talks to the bishop about this, he explains that his problem with her wasn't necessarily that she reached out to David Nelson, is that she did so without his awareness of it, that she really needs to learn how to stand in her own voice. So the other part of seeing the intra-group or within group dynamics is you also see a father who loves his daughter, who really encourages her and supports her in the role of associate pastor, but also understand it's going to come with some disagreement. So you see them have their familial aspect of who she is runs in tension with their professional sense of how they see themselves and their roles in the institution. Lastly, I will briefly touch on navigating romantic and familial relationships. With this tension, you have Grace Greenleaf's romantic life in many ways is juxtaposed against her parents. Her parents being the face of the church, they display their love on stage every Sunday. Lady May has a very active and visible role in the church. Grace Greenleaf's decisions about her personal life do not adhere to respectability or silence politics. So she, in many ways, adheres to what we call one episode is aptly titled Silence and Loneliness, where she has to decide to stay on her own or to stay quiet about who she dates. She has a child later learned with a former member of the church, but she left when she was pregnant and then comes back with her, that child was actually put up for adoption. She comes back with a teenage daughter who is, she's divorced from her dad, but later find out she has another child. So her mother rides her pretty hard about her romantic life, but she is faced with this choice of, can she even have a romantic life? And if so, does she have to have it in silence? The familiar relationships become problematic for her. And as I mentioned, her son, AJ, who she put up for adoption and then becomes a major character later in the series, she actually has to make a choice to support her son or to stay in the role of the associate pastor. So she actually, in one of her sermons, decides that she's going to stand by her son and she quits her role of associate pastor. So even though you can see through her role of leadership and through self-definition of how she changes that role of associate pastor, she still deals with some of the tensions, particularly in her spiritual, romantic, and familial life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Glenn. I just want to just let everyone know that we will put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will take those questions at the end when we have our questions and discussion. So remember, put your questions in the Q&A box. Okay. Next, we're going to welcome Dr. Camille J. Anderson, and she's going to share with us the beloved language community, a call for womanism and language to address the racial academic achievement gap, and just a little bit about Dr. Anderson. Dr. Anderson is an interculturalist, scholar, and language advocate Originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dr. Anderson has always kept a tight grip on her passion and compassion for others and difference through language. Her primary focus is family empowerment through language with an emphasis on application and confidence. She holds a bachelor's degree in Spanish from Spelman College, a master's degree in international affairs, interdisciplinary studies in international communication and anthropology from American University, and a PhD in communication and culture from Howard University. Dr. Camille Anderson has published extensively in both English and Spanish, in scholarly and trade journals, as well as in national US news publications. In addition to From Sabotage to Support, A New Vision for Feminist Solidarity in the Workplace, which she co-authored, she has published several other books, including Raising Bilingual Brown Babies, Everyday Strategies to Become a Confident Bilingual Family. I'd like to present to you now Dr. Camille J. Anderson.
Thank you, Dr. Matlock. You make me sound so phenomenal. I am here today, yes, to talk about the beloved language community. So we are going to take the charge that Tony Blackman had in Dr. Johnson's presentation about the resources to fix certain things in regards to the school system. We're also going to look at how I also am using an autoethnographic backdrop, essentially, in order to be able to talk about how this would go about. So again, so also touching on what Dr. Johnson shared with us when it comes to the embodied discourse from Brittany Cooper as well. So I consider myself to be an Afrocentric linguistic activist. And in that realm, what I did in this chapter was I wanted to address the idea of racial justice in the foreign language classroom. The foreign language classroom is that place that tends to be ignored because it is assumed that culture is always present. And while that might be true, there are aspects of culture that are often overlooked, often ignored, and often silenced when it comes to the foreign language classroom. So when we're looking at this idea of a beloved language community, we have to be able to start from the point of racial justice being a very little discussed issue in order to advance in foreign language learning for African American students. In this chapter, I talked about being able to center the experiences of the Black child in the foreign language classroom in order to have a positive influence on language retention. And for those of us that have an understanding of foreign language learning, we understand that it is what those skills that we get in foreign language classes that actually help to support and actually complement what we get in our language arts classes, as well as our history classes, and sometimes even in the math and sciences as well. So I'm challenging the able to adopt new pedagogical strategies that will focus and center Blackness in the foreign language classroom. And I do this by looking at three things in particular within the chapter. So I want to, at least in the short time that I have today, talk to you a little bit about liberatory bilingualism, this marriage between womanism and Afrocentricity, and then being able to bring all that together to talk about what should be present in the beloved language community in the classroom. So when we're thinking in terms of liberatory bilingualism, what we're talking about specifically is the ways in which we teach Black children how to use language as a tool of liberation and a tool of empowerment, and not just that thing that they use to check off in order to make sure that they complete the requirements for graduation. So being able to show them that language is actually a tool that can free them, as opposed to a tool that can that is a point of disdain, a point of discomfort, and a point of angst. And for a lot of Black children in particular, the idea of going into the foreign language classroom comes with a lot of trepidation. So being able to use the concepts and the notions around liberatory bilingualism in order to be able to assuage some of that angst that might be present with them by showing them where their liberation is present in the midst of it. For me, my background primarily is Spanish. So when I'm talking about this, I'm looking at this from how can I free you with Spanish? How can I relieve you of some of these oppressive notions with the use of the Spanish language? That's what I typically do when I'm thinking about liberatory bilingualism. But in order to do that, we have to be able to unite womanism and Afrocentricity in a very particular way. So when we're thinking about the things that need to be present when it comes to the classroom that focuses on social justice, we know that we're supposed to make sure that our students have self-love and knowledge. We know that they have to be able to gain a respect for history and characteristics of people that are different from themselves. That's what the foreign language class does, just in general anyway. We also have to be able to help these children to be able to critically examine how identities impact people's lived and material conditions, including their own. So it's not just looking at it from an outside perspective, but also taking in how they're able to actually to address these lived experiences and connect them to the foreign language classroom. Teaching how people fought against oppression during and through other social movements. So what are the ways in which you can use the Spanish language in order to be able to show them what other social movements look like across the globe, within the diaspora, within language, and being able to engage in activities that increase awareness of others and experience what it means to struggle for justice through social action. And all of these things happen with the use of language. So being able to look at how this marriage between womanism and Afrocentricity would actually work, what we're talking about is being able to address and challenge oppressionist ideologies that are present in the foreign language classrooms. Being able to understand that there is a way in which language hegemony is very much present in the foreign language classroom, because there are aspects of language that are not necessarily included on purpose in those classrooms. We have all of these current discussions around this idea of academic language and whether or not it is considered oppressive, whether or not it's considered implicit bias, whether that is supremacist, all of these different things. And in the foreign language classroom, when looking at the Black child, the answer is yes, they are. They are oppressionists, they are supremacists, they are indeed these things. So how do you challenge these types of ideologies within the language, within the classroom? Being able to counter these notions of individualism. We know that the school systems are set up in a way that it's I, my A, my B's, my C's, my D's. How do we then bring back the sense of community that is very much present within womanist thought, within Afrocentric thought, in order to be able to make sure that these children are able to see language as something that is going to connect them to others that look like them, not just in the classroom, but beyond it as well. And it also encourages things that we typically try to discourage in other classrooms. In the language arts classroom, you don't typically embrace the use of vernacular. But what we're suggesting with this marriage of womanism and Afrocentricity within the foreign language classroom is that you are purposefully teaching the Africanisms that are present in the language. So if you are a French teacher or a Spanish teacher or a German teacher, which have large populations of Black bodies that live in those countries that speak those languages, how do you then address how they're able to see the Blackness, the similarities between how they speak, the vernacular that they use in English in the United States versus the vernaculars that are present also in the languages that they're learning? And then being able to bring that all together with this spiritual component and being able to understand that it's difficult to be a womanist teacher and not include spirituality in some way. You cannot remove it in any way, shape, or form. So then how do you embrace that and then bring it into the classroom in a way that allows the students to be able to see that it is their full self that is being acknowledged and perceived in the classroom? And that's what brings us to this idea of the beloved language community. And after I wrote this chapter, I came across Foster and Foster et al. And they have this concept called the heuristic for thinking about culturally responsive teaching, or HITCRIT. And in this, there are very specific things that they want people to be able to look at in order to make sure that their teaching is actually culturally responsive. And that's essentially what we're talking about here when we're talking about liberatory bilingualism in the classroom, being able to center the Black child. And when looking at those components that they want to be able to include in these heuristics and how we're able to consider this, you can see why it's so important to be able to use womanism and Afrocentricity in that classroom in order to address the ways in which racial justice can be more likely achievable and attainable within the foreign language classroom. So they have 4 components that come with this. And one of the components they have is this notion of style. And with style, we're talking about linguistic style, of course. So that means that pulls back that use of vernacular that I just talked about when it comes to the combining of womanism and Afrocentricity. But it also includes music and movement. as a former dancer, I love that part, but it's being able to embrace this idea of being able to use music as a type of style of speaking, being able to use dance as a type of style of speaking, and being able to look at what are the rules for talking and listening, not what the teacher says is in the book, but being able to apply the rules for talking and speaking that are present in that child's home. And how then do you use language according to that? And that is something where when we're talking about teachers being culturally culturally mismatched. There we go. We talk about teachers being culturally mismatched. We're talking about this notion of them not being able to do that part, them not being able to see what is happening in the homes and understand it enough to be able to teach it or to be able to apply it in the classroom. And especially in the foreign language classroom, because the idea is you just want them to be able to say, hola, ¿cómo estás? Estoy bien, and that's it, right? We're not really talking about them being able to delve any further and seeing how they can apply that in the home. I just need you to say these things so that you can pass this class and get out. But when you're looking at style from this hit crit perspective, you have to include the rules of engagement and how they can apply the language to the rules of engagement that they understand. They also talk about this notion of text, and text is not just what's in the book. When we're talking text, we're talking art. So are they pulling in Afrocentric or Afro-Latino artists into the classroom in order for them to be able to see how those things are communicated? Are they looking at clothing? Because the woman in Barranquilla dress is totally different than the woman that's in Cuba. And being able to show what those nuances are, being able to see how they're able to find these designers that might be in these various countries, these Black designers, and how they're able to incorporate Africanisms and what that communicates, and being able to help the child to be able to see that. And we're really talking about this notion of intertextuality and not just the words that are in the book. You have to go beyond the book in order for you to be able to really create the sense of a beloved language community. And then we also have to include the socio-emotional part of it. And this is where that idea of being able to center spirituality in the classroom is important, because you have to think about social and emotional learning in the classroom. It's not just about them, again, being able to just get the basics, being able to count to 10 in Spanish. It's not just about those things. It's about how they're able to apply how they learn about things socially from home. It's pulling in a lot of home knowledge into the classroom and making it just as important, and being able to play on how we're able to use the language in order to address emotions. That means that you might not necessarily follow the rules or the order that might be given to you by the state or by the district in terms of what it is that they need to learn, because you might think that something else is more important. As a former Spanish teacher, I got into a lot of trouble for doing that. It's important for these children to know how to count money in Spanish, because they're going to the bodega every day after school. So I need them to count money before I get them to know these colors. These colors are not as important as these numbers. And I would get into a lot of trouble for that, for not following the rules and the norms that come with the standards and the way they want the standards to be taught. But in order to make sure that you're addressing that social learning and that emotional learning, you have to be able to think outside the box. And that is essentially what we're doing as Womanist scholars, correct? We're always thinking outside of the box. And the last thing is this notion of institutional knowledge. And this is where we walk this really delicate line between this idea of them understanding that there is a language hegemony, but not necessarily embodying the language hegemony, because it's a way to be able to make sure that they are learning that there is academic knowledge, but there is also very much home knowledge, and that home knowledge is just as important than what it is that you're getting in the classroom. And we would say it's the idea of teaching code switching. We don't necessarily have a book, we don't have a text, we don't have guidelines for how we go about learning code switching, but we all do it. There's not a single person on this panel or that might be listening that does not in some way know what it means to code switch. And it just comes to us, in being able to show the children how to do that, not to correct them when they make mistakes, not to silence the Black part of their speaking, not to disengage from them when they seem to appear to not get it the way you want them to get it, but to embrace it fully and completely, in order for them to be able to have this understanding of seeing their whole selves in the classroom. And the reason why this is so critical is because one of the things that we're learning, because the title of my chapter is about addressing the racial academic achievement gap, but the racial academic achievement gap is not on the students. The academic achievement gap is really the teachers that are lacking and have gaps and holes, how they're actually making sure that they're pulling out the best in all of their students. And that includes the Black child, and should center the Black child when you do so. You cannot pull out the achievements and the best of a Black child using a white standard, just like you would not pull out the best of an Asian or Latinx student by using only a particular standard. So you have to be able to incorporate all of these things. And that's what makes the beloved language community. The idea of having this beloved community where everyone feels embraced, everyone feels honored, everyone feels respected, and everyone feels seen is critical. And this chapter challenges foreign language teachers to be able to do more of that in order to make sure that it does not end up with where at this point, a lot of my clients will say, I left that Spanish in that classroom. I don't know anything. I could barely say hola, and I studied for 4 years. And part of the reason of that is because there was never an intentional effort to include their bodies as important in the classroom. If you can recall on your own, how many times do you remember seeing a Black body in the books that you had for your foreign language classes? Few and far between. And being able to take this idea of liberatory bilingualism, being able to take this marriage of womanism and Afrocentricity in order to make sure that you are genuinely engaging a beloved language community being one of the 5 C's of language learning, connections and cultures being part of those, of being 2 other of the 5 C's that are a part of foreign language learning, but being able to do that in a more intentional way that allows the Black child especially to feel as though this is something that is theirs to own and not just theirs to see and witness from afar. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I am really enjoying the diversity of thought and application of womanism and Black feminist thought here. And so our next contributor, our next special guest is Dr. Michelle Meggs. And Dr. Meggs, her doctorate is in arts and humanities. And so I wanted to make that very clear. She worked hard for that. And I wanted to make that very clear. Dr. Meggs is a native of Brooklyn, New York. She earned her Bachelor of Arts from Johnson C. Smith University, her Master of Divinity degree from Wake Forest University, and Doctor of Arts and Humanities from Clark Atlanta University, with a focus on Africana women's studies. And she currently serves as the Executive Director of the Women and Girls Research Alliance at UNC Charlotte. Her research and ministry interests are in areas of Black women's spirituality, Black women's images in popular culture, and deconstructing the stereotypes that negatively impact Black women's lives. Dr. Meggs is going to talk with us about, is there room for the ratchet in the beloved community? If you're not liberating everyone, are you really talking about freedom? Dr. Michelle Meggs.
Good evening, and thank you so much for that introduction. I really, really appreciate it. One of the questions that I often get when I talk about ratchet womanism is where did you get that from? And how did you combine this idea of ratchetness and womanism? Because no one seems to see the connections there. A lot of it emerged when I was writing my dissertation. My dissertation focused on Tyler Perry's Medea character and Christian E. Porter's Miss Shirlene character. Shout out to my dissertation advisor, Dr. Stephanie Evans, who's at Georgia State. And what I wanted to do was, so much of the scholarship around Perry's character of Medea was always negative, and how the character continuously pulled up this specter of the Black mammy or the Jezebel. There was never anything written that there was possibly this kind of redeeming character, or that the character had anything to offer the community. That doesn't say that the character that Perry was offering wasn't problematic, because it was, right? In terms of the ways in which he offered an image of Black womanhood, and how he wore Blackness and all of that, right? All of that was problematic. But in looking at the character and how she was so easily dismissed, as if she had nothing better to offer. And then there was this issue around gender, his performance of gender, that became an issue. And so I said, there has to be something more to this than what we're getting. And so this idea of ratchetness came from my students when I was working at the AUC, because they would run around accusing each other of being ratchet. And I was like, what does that even mean? And so as I began to unpack that and look at Perry's character, and working on my dissertation, my chair suggested that I compare Perry with the Miss Charlene character, who is a young woman who plays an older kind of Southern aunt, not grandmother, but aunt, who just is real. She sings on the choir, and she has the senior choir come into Cardi B, right? And so that would be considered ratchet, right? And ratchetness, in its original inception, was about expressing yourself, right? The ways that just everyday people, a Little Boozy had this song called Do the Ratchet that came out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and out of that community. And its original inception was about everybody having fun, right? It wasn't read negatively against Black women's bodies or their behavior. If you look at the lyrics of the song, it says everybody do the ratchet. It was judges, lawyers, doctors, police officers, right? It was this kind of community where folks could just let loose and have fun. But over time, this idea of ratchet, which is a play on the word wretched, became negatively read on Black women's bodies, which became this commentary around how Black women dressed, how they talked, how they behaved, the kind of work that they engaged in, all of that. And none of it was positive, right? And so what I began to do in my research was to look at the ways that Black women's behaviors began to resist how the larger cultures say they should behave, which again goes against the respectability politics that my panelists have beautifully articulated, and also the kind of intercultural ways that Black folks say that Black women should behave. And what does that mean? And how do Black women begin to take ownership of their own bodies and not allow Black folks or other folks to tell them how they should behave, right? So then why does ratchet womanism matter, right? Because it's necessary for Black women and girls to kind of have this space to engage in ways that will lead to their freedom and to their joy, and to the ultimate expressions of who they are without shame or without judgment, right? Because there's always judgment around Black women's bodies. If we look at Michelle Obama, judgment around her wearing short sleeve shirts, judgment around the skirt she wears, right? Oh, well, because she has a Black woman's body, oh, well, her behind, is enticing other men, as if she is responsible for that. She really isn't, right? It's important to have what Brittany Cooper coined like a disrespectability politic, right? That resists this idea of silencing and marginalizing Black women and girls that happens when they show their strengths, right? And when Black girls and when Black women's strengths are misrecognized, right? If you speak up, right, and speak out against how you're being treated, now you're angry, right? If you're laughing loud, right? If you're just expressing your joyfulness, now you're being disrupted, right? And there were some stories in the news about young Black girls who were standing outside of their lockers at school, being loud and being joyful. But because that joy was misread, and because school administrators weren't accustomed to hearing Black girls be expressive, they were accused of being on drugs and strip searched, right? So what does it mean when Black joy can't be expressed freely, right? So it's critical, right? right? For Black women and girls to begin to engage in discourses that teach them how to challenge, to resist these kind of sexist and racist and classes and even homophobic ideologies that limit their possibilities of being, right? And so ratchet womanism, right, taking Alice Walker's womanism and even extending it out further, right, to reach a new generation of young Black women and girls, right, to question and interrogate the ways and kind of talk back to these systems, right? So it dismantles the way that respectability politics pathologizes poor and working class women and girls and gives them space to kind of build alliances with each other, right? So that there are lessons that they can learn from each other, right? Because what ratchet womanism already assumes, right, is the humanity of Black women and girls, right? And that the way that they are is already okay, right? That I don't need to be fixed, that my loud laughter is okay, right? That the way that I show up is okay, that there's nothing inherently wrong with me, right? Which I think is a narrative that we need to hear more of and that we don't often get, right? And so it is a reminder also that the wisdom of Black women comes from different places. Fannie Lou Hamer, says you can have all the D's or no D's, but until you do this work, what you're talking about really doesn't matter, right? I'm paraphrasing, right? Because she experienced a critique because she didn't have a degree, as if the work she wasn't doing on the ground didn't matter, right? Ratchet womanism affirms that the wisdom of Black women can come from any corner, right? So there's wisdom to be found in various places in the community. It can come from the women who sit in the college classroom. It can also come from the sister who is mopping the floor in a hospital. It doesn't matter, right? It validates this kind of homegrown knowledge and wisdom of Black women that can be loud and that can be quiet. But what ratchet womanism also says is that there is a standard, right? If you just being loud to be loud, just to be disruptive, I'm not calling that ratchet, I'm calling that trifling, right? There is a difference. Ratchetness points towards liberation, right? It's a behavior that at its outset looks to set other people free, right? And that's the critical piece of it. To be loud, just to be loud isn't helpful for anyone. Ratchet womanism is about liberating us from those structures, from those systems, and from those ways of being that prevent Black women from being their most authentic selves, right? And that's all that includes institutions that tells us that the ways that we do research is not valid, that it has to fit within these particular norms in order to count. Ratchet womanism says, no, that's not it, right? And so what does that mean? It means that the ways that Black women present themselves, because it takes all kinds of Black women to make the community work, not just one. So ratchet womanism speaks to this idea of the beloved community and says, you don't get to decide who gets to represent what Black womanhood looks like, right? Because within this idea of King's beloved community, is that there's this way that Black women need to be represented. So it looks like Rosa Parks, but it doesn't look like Fannie Lou Hamer, right? It looks like, my mind just drew a blank, but it doesn't look like a pregnant 15-year-old Claudette Colvin who sat on a bus before Rosa Parks even arrived, right? So it doesn't look like Claudette Colvin, it looks like Diane Nash, right? And so that in and of itself is problematic. And so what ratchet womanism says is, I get to decide who I want to be. And if you don't like it, that's not my problem, that's yours. And you need to examine the lens through which you're choosing to see me. Now, I can help you clarify that lens and we can dig a little bit deeper behind why you're choosing to see me that way, because you're seeing that way because of racism, sexism, homophobia, white supremacy, and the ways in which some folks choose to worship at the altar of whiteness, which for Black people is always dangerous, right? Ratchet womanism says that I'm choosing to be seen, and it also understands the danger that comes with being seen, right? Because in order to be seen, that leaves yourself open for critique, right? But ratchet womanism is willing to take the risk, right? So ratchet womanism is doing three things. It's advocating for agency, that you get to choose what's best for you and no one else gets to define that for you. You get to act boldly in the midst of very dangerous circumstances. It also chooses freedom, that I get to move, speak, and act in the way that I see fit, right? And that I get to utilize language that's familiar to me and knowledge that's familiar to me as valid, which also fits into this language of womanism, which meets Black women right where they are, as sisters, where you are is good, right? Again, it also risks visibility, right? To be seen and to be heard, which is both good and is also, it can also be dangerous, and it rejects the community that says that you need to be hidden because of how you present. And so ratchet womanism offers us an opportunity to reject this binary around a good and bad Black womanhood. It says there isn't such a thing. There is just womanhood. There is a Black womanhood, but there's no one way to do that. So ratchet womanism says no to defining who I am without my permission. And it says I get to do that. And it just kind of rejects the ways that Black women are put on the outside and forced to look in. And ratchet womanism just kicks in the door and says, I have a place to be here. I'm going to sit here. You will see me, you will hear me, and you will talk to me. And I refuse to be excluded anymore. So thank you.
Amen. We went to church on that, and we're going to church again with Ms. Netanya Blackman-Listach. Women step forward doing rhetorical historiography by exploring womanist leadership in the AME Church. And I'm going to read to you about our senior instructor and assistant director of forensics at Middle Tennessee State University. Our future doctor here, Ms. Netanya Listach. She is also a doctoral student in the Department of Communication and Film at the University of Memphis. Her research focuses on race, gender, and religion, with specific emphasis on African-American rhetoric and public address. She is a member of the following organizations: National Communication Association, National Sorority of Phi Delta Kappa Inc., Organization for the Study of Communication, Language, and Gender, Southern States Communication Association, and Tennessee Communication Association. When she's not researching or teaching, she enjoys lazy days with her girls, Lizzie and Zane, and her husband, John. Welcome, Ms. Future Dr. Netanya Listach, and her writing and dissertation advisor, Dr. Andre E. Johnson. Welcome.
Well, I am going to allow Netanya to share a little bit about our chapter. I am here just to be here to witness this brilliance that I am witnessing, and all of this fine intellectual acumen that is in this Zoom room. I am so excited to be part of this project. I am so glad that Doctors Annette Matlock and Sharice Glenn Manigault came to me and asked to have this particular book in our R3 series. And basically what I just want to talk about today is a little bit about the series. As you can see in the background here, there are several books in the R3 series, and R3 is Rhetoric, Race, and Religion. And we thought that this book would be a fine addition to that series. So if anyone is listening, if you're looking for a place for your book, as you would also note, Dr. Kimberly Johnson's The Womanist Preacher is part of that of this series as well as Amanda Nell Eggers and my book, The struggle over Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. So if you're looking for a place for your book, if you are looking for a space where you
Dr.
could
Meggs, is she
begin,
looking for a space?
if you're looking for something,
Dr. Michelle Meggs?
I
done called you out now.
see.
We waiting on it.
I wasn't gonna say anything, but I did see.
Listen.
I felt the
Support it. I support it.
Ma'am,
It's coming.
If you're looking for a space now,
We'll talk.
please reach
We'll
out to
talk.
me. On all seriousness,
we'll talk.
I am the associate professor of communication at the University of Memphis, and one of the things that I wanted to do when I came to Memphis is to create a strong African American rhetoric and public address program within the program, a strong emphasis. And one of those strong strands is womanist rhetoric. Dr. Kimberly Johnson actually really kind of gave birth to that. And when I got there, I kind of cultivated it. And then, of course, with the latest addition, Dr. Diana Watkins Dickerson, who just graduated on last year, I'm doing her dissertation on womanist rhetorical theory. So one of the things that we're trying to do at the University of Memphis is to create this atmosphere where this type of scholarship and research is not only supported and welcome, but it's encouraged, and we hope to build on this work as well too, as you're going to hear my co-author, Sister Natanya, come and eloquently talk about our chapter. So I'll leave it at that right now. I am again so honored and privileged to be in the Zoom room, to be around you, and to be colleagues as we continue to build together. Thanks.
I feel like I should say a blanket of thanks to everyone for allowing me to be a part of this. I am enjoying being in this space as well. But I do have to thank Dr. Diana Watkins Dickerson, because she's the one who encouraged me to submit my abstract to this, because originally I wasn't going to do it. I was just going to let it pass. I'm glad I didn't. I'm really glad I didn't. So as a member of the AME Church myself and the product of strong Black women, I was definitely interested in the church's role in creating strong women candidates for leadership positions in the AME Church. Naturally, that also led to my interest in womanism and its use or its lack of use in the AME Church's pulpit and its leadership. The AME Church was created because of racial discrimination. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones walked out of St. George because they were tired of dealing with discrimination from the white congregation. And while Richard Allen worked hard to create the AME Church, he wasn't alone. He wasn't working alone. His wife, Sarah, created the Daughters of the Conference, and this group made sure that ministers had everything that they needed to be successful while traveling on that ministry circuit. The men wouldn't have been able to do their jobs as ministers if the women weren't supporting them. So the Daughters of the Conference worked within the political structure of the church, which allowed them to set that foundation for both the emergence of womanist theology in the AME Church, as well as an environment that allowed women to take on leadership roles within that structure. So we looked at 4 women: Dorena Lee, Sarah Ann Copeland Hughes, Hallie Quinn Brown, and Dr. Jamie Coleman Williams, to look at the trajectory of womanist theology in the AME Church. Dorena Lee was the first female pastor in the AME Church, and she joined after hearing Richard Allen preach. She received her call to preach in 1807, but because of the AME Church's ban on women ministers, she was only allowed to conduct prayer meetings and become an exhorter. But you know how we're always told to be prepared? It's one of my favorite stories. She was attending a church service, a minister froze up, and she seized her moment. She jumped up, she finished the sermon for the pastor, and she noted specifically in her journal, during the exhortation, God made manifest his power in a manner sufficient to show the world that I was called to labor according to my ability and the grace given unto me in the vineyard of the good husbandman. So Lee's confidence in her calling to the ministry, as well as her dedication to the AME Church, ultimately persuaded Richard Allen to support her calling to the ministry. And although Allen licensed Lee to preach, she wasn't allowed to be ordained. So even though that calling was legitimized in the eyes of a male leadership figure, the church's hierarchical structure denied her the ability to become a full preacher in the AME church. So her ministry was not necessarily dedicated to a womanist theology, but her focus on a God who called both men and women to preach showed the beginnings of womanist theology. Sarah, also known as Sally, and Copeland Hughes experienced that same type of rejection that Lee did. She was an evangelist and she wasn't assigned to a church, but she was able to serve as needed. But that was only if the male pastors invited her to come in and serve. In 1882, she was appointed to a church in Fayetteville, North Carolina, but because she wasn't a man, she dealt with pay discrimination and resentment from her male colleagues. Even though she had a fruitful ministry, she was able to build churches, she conducted revivals, she gained converts, and you would think that her reaffirmation at the next General Conference in 1884 wouldn't have been a problem. Instead, the delegates of the General Conference supported a resolution that denied women the privilege of receiving a pastoral license. So the church she ministered was so saddened by this that they decided to disband and look for other church homes. But Copeland stayed in the AME church, and in 1885, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner ordained her as a deacon. This ordination was short-lived as well, because in 1887, Bishop Jabez Campbell ruled that her ordination was against church law and had her name removed from the list of deacons. And after 1888, she doesn't even appear in the AME church records. Around that same time, Copeland Hughes was struggling against the pastoral patriarchal hierarchy. Hallie Quinn Brown was fighting for equal rights as a public reader, a speaker, and an advocate for women's rights and civil rights. An active member of the AME church, as well as a professor at Wilberforce University, she went touring around the country, speaking about the achievements of African American women and across the globe. She stated in one of her speeches, "Talk not of the Negro woman's incapacity, of her inferiority, until the centuries of her hideous servitude have been succeeded by centuries of education, culture, and refinement, by which she may rise to the fullness of the stature of her highest ideal." So it would make sense that Brown would want to become the first female Secretary of Education of the AME Church. Yet while Bishop Turner supported her wholeheartedly, she lost her bid due to the church's hierarchical structure and its male leadership. Lee, Copeland, Hughes, and Brown were not able to see their vision of women in leadership positions in the AME church, but Dr. Jamie Coleman Williams, who actually sat in Hallie Quinn Brown's classroom, carried on that fight for equality. Dr. Williams taught at 4 AME colleges. She was at Edward Waters College, Shorter College, Morris Brown College, and Wilberforce University before she went to TSU, Tennessee State University. And while there, Dr. Williams taught students who would become doctors, engineers, college presidents, and even bishops in the AME church, which worked to her advantage. She also served in the AME church as president of the 13th District Lay Organization and the editor of the AME Church Review. Ultimately, she was elected as the first female general officer in the AME church. And in an interview with Larry Crow, she recalled, "When I ran, my sex did not become an issue. And I think it was because of the friendships I had with all these people and the people who had been our students." Dr. Williams was also an activist. She worked with various community and civic groups, and she served on the executive committee of the NAACP for over 40 years. So her activism, combined with her knowledge of church structure, was instrumental in the election of the first female bishop in the AME church in the year 2000, Vashti Murphy McKenzie. So these 4 women demonstrate the tenacity of women in the AME church, and their legacy has continued in the present generation. Overall, the AME church has made great strides in equality and representation of its female members in leadership positions. And through the work of these current members, the AME church is going to continue to move forward.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Dr. Johnson, do you have anything to add?
I just thought that was a fine presentation. And when you have fine presentations in front of you, I think we ought to just sit and just bask in the greatness that we just heard.
You're gonna breathe. Breathe.
There you go.
well, I'm looking at the time and I want to get to our Q&A, our questions and our discussion. And so I am going to go into, all right. Donna Van Hook has a question. Should we identify a difference between police reform and transformational justice? And is there a difference? Who, Kimberly?
Sure. Okay, so when I think of police reform, that deals with the perception of the police and, you know, are they going to profile me because I'm Black? Are they legitimate or are they crooked, right? So that's what I think of in terms of police reform, trying to change that particular perception that people have of police officers. But then when it comes to transformational justice, that one actually offers opportunities for the offender and the survivors, or some might call them victims, to actually come together and to talk about their concerns and to talk about their hurts. And it offers an opportunity for healing. And it also offers an opportunity for them to think of ways and then implement those changes to make sure that this never happens again. And so I see the work that Womanists are doing is, you know, definitely transformational, especially what I talked about in chapter 2. That was transformational justice work. Thank you for the question.
And there's another question here. It's talking about the statement, your silence will not save you. What do we mean by that? What do we do with that? Your silence will not save you. Donna, can you type a clarification on your question in the chat, who you're directing that to? If you're still here. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Looking at contemporary Black churches, and historically there's been this patriarchy. Just basically, do you have any thoughts on Black church patriarchy? That was pretty much it. Dr. Johnson?
No, I'm sitting back. Go right ahead. Go right ahead. I'll jump in a little bit later, maybe.
Okay. Black church patriarchy. How do we address that as womanists? What are we doing with that?
I think Black church patriarchy had a long, hard struggle with womanist theology, even though the womanist theology was already there and had rooted itself in the church. It just was not allowed to do anything because of how strong that patriarchy was. But I think it was really just a matter of the culture that we're in, the society that we're in. So everything that we were seeing in all the other cultures and all the patriarchy in the other cultures was trickling down onto us as well.
Okay. I'd like to also answer that question. So when I think about Black patriarchy, I also think about religious patriarchy, and Natanya definitely touched on this in her presentation, because in religious patriarchy, that's when they use the Bible and the church doctrines to put women in their place. And so it makes me think about Jarena Lee when she first went to Richard Allen in 1807 and asked if she could preach. And he was just like, no, because our church discipline does not call for women. And so, no, you cannot preach because we don't have women preachers. You know, like that's an example of this Black patriarchy or religious patriarchy, if you will.
Okay. I'm gonna look at this. Your silence will not save you, and I'm going to the way that I'm looking at this. What do you do with this? Your silence will not save you. Being quiet and just taking it is not going to do anything for our communities or for us. So that means you've heard this new saying: if you see something, say something. Well, you have to say something. Dr. Meggs has talked about it. Being able to redefine and identify who we are, our behavior, not going within these different paradigms. Dr. Anderson's talked about it. Your silence will not save you in the classroom, because when we don't say anything, when we know what to say, because sometimes we don't say anything because we don't know what to say and we don't know what to do. And so we're being silenced because we just don't know. But when we do know, we have to speak up. And so you have this energy surrounding historically Black women in Dr. Johnson's and Netanya's work. Women said something. They did something because there was something that was coming out of their spirit that says, I need to do something here. And yes, there's risk. There's when it's important, when it's valuable, and we do not stay silent, there is always risk. Risk to person, risk to family, risk to, right now, I didn't talk about it for the sake of time, but my chapter, coming out of a Christian nationalist religious right, totally indoctrinated in segregationist ideology and theology, to speak up in that space, that was risk. I got death threats when your colleagues tell you to watch your back. So there's always risk. So your silence won't save you. And so speaking up's not going to save you. So you might as well say something. You might as well speak up. And the other, there's another question here of the beloved community. The beloved community was a theme throughout every one of the presentations and throughout the chapters in the book, is because in order to have that beloved community, we need to have care and concern for each other. What I call the womanist ethic of care. We need to have that. Our experience is centered, but we never leave anybody behind. We care for everyone. And so that is what's happening throughout the themes of all these presentations. And so if you want to expand again and talk about, just hit it right on the head, beloved community. Dr. Anderson, what does that look like in a foreign language classroom?
It actually connects the notion of silence as well for me, because silence is supremacy in the foreign language classroom. When you choose to be silent about the Black bodies that are present in language, you are perpetuating white supremacy. You are perpetuating that language hegemony. You are perpetuating those language hierarchies that we have so well established within academic spaces. And for me, the beloved language community challenges that notion of silence being that perpetuator of oppression, and it forces a voice on, it demands the voice of those who are not typically included in those conversations in the foreign language classroom, who move away from the European models of language learning and going more towards the diasporic, being able to look at Martinique as well as France, being able to look at Colombia as well as Spain, being able to look at Cuba as well as Colombia, and being able to include all of those voices in the language classroom in order to make sure that all are represented.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Glenn.
I'm going to take my answer combined with one of the other questions I see in there about Bishop's character in Greenleaf and how he supports his daughter and has tensions with her and with his wife as well. One of the things that happens when we shift to womanist frames, instead of primarily focusing on patriarchal frames that are Western, is it brings in a dynamic of who we are as African-American people and other people in the African diaspora, particularly this notion of communalism and connection. So power then shifts from being this coercive mechanism I hold over you to power being something that I share. And if we can share it, then we can empower and lift each other up. And that's one of the tensions that exists with Grace Greenleaf and her father in particular, where he knows he's the lead of the church, but he's using that role to bring, he calls her Gigi, Grace Greenleaf's daughter Gigi, back into the church when she feels like she doesn't have a place there. So he uses his power to empower her and give her a space and a voice, even when she disagrees with him, which is not something you typically see when you have two people in power, a father-daughter relationship. And to the silence point, he actually chastises her for going behind his back and staying silent. Like, if you're going to do something, you have to stand in it. So like, let your yes be your yes and your no being your no. If you don't stand up in who you are, nobody will know who you are. More importantly, you won't know who you are. So the sense of silence and voice is important. It does come with risk, as Dr. Matlock said, but it also is an important part of agency and enacting change and figuring out who you are in your terms and not limiting yourself to somebody else's.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Meggs.
Yes, ma'am.
Beloved community.
Well, I think the beloved community is a place where the needs are met regardless of how people show up, right? Mental, spiritual, physical, economic, social, educational, as Dr. Anderson would insist, right? That those who show up, the needs that they present, and that we have people who are astute enough in the community to sense what is also not being said. And that's where the spiritual piece and where the womanist piece comes in, that we are in tune enough with our own humanity and with the humanity of others, that we are able to respond to that which is also being unsaid, right? And that's part of being the beloved community, that you can respond to what you see and then be sensitive and in tune enough to respond to what you don't see. To me, that is part of what the beloved community does, that we respond to what's needed on the ground, and that we're also available for other needs that people may not be able to articulate, or don't have the language to articulate. Womanism leaves space for that. It leaves room for that, for you to create that language if you don't have it, or to use the language that exists within a community to communicate it, right? So to me, that's what the beloved community is, that people are welcome. And where there are rough edges, the community helps with that, right? And not always coming to chastise or criticize, but how can we help, right? Because you can love someone through something and get a better result, I think, than when you come with chastising and consistently coming with critique.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Johnson, beloved community.
Okay, so beloved community centers love and it centers community. And womanism is about bringing everyone along with them on this journey towards liberation and social justice. And when I think about Black Lives Matter, that resists dehumanization, right? And so this whole notion of anti-respectability politics then allows us to enact our agency, and it gives us license to be our authentic selves. And so we get to be authentically who we are, and we get to bring that to the movement. We get to bring that to the table. And so I see that as this beloved community that honors humanity.
Dr. Johnson?
Oh, the other Dr. Johnson. There you
Yes, the A.E. Johnson.
A.E. Johnson. All right. All right. All right. Listen, again, this is just wonderful discussion. This is a wonderful time to really begin to have these type of discussions because of all the stuff that's going on in the world right now. However, let me put a point where I think one needs to be placed when we talk about beloved community. The beloved community operates out of truth, honesty, working towards reconciliation, all those wonderful things. But what I think womanism and the power that womanism has is its critique in order to shape the beloved community. In other words, let us never forget, a womanist rhetoric is also a prophetic rhetoric. It is a rhetoric that is grounded in the sacred. Dr. Anderson mentioned earlier about spirituality. It is a rhetoric that is also that also critiques and judges and uplifts and empowers and all of those things that prophetic discourse does as well. So if the community is out of kilter, it is a womanist rhetoric can come and help the beloved, help the community become again the beloved community. Because when you have a bunch of individuals, and a lot of times when individuals are broken, hurting each other because they don't know how to receive the love and care that they so desperately need, a womanist vision or a womanist ethic of care, somebody smart talks about that. Womanism then can come and provide that atmosphere in which we can be and still be in the beloved community. So once again, glad to be here, glad to be a part of this discussion.
Our future doctor, did you have anything you want to add to that? To the beloved community?
Ditto.
Okay. She said, I'm done talking for the night.
Well, no, I will say this. Looking
He
at
is
the
a
beloved,
wonderful student, by the way.
Yes.
He is a wonderful student.
thank you. I will say this. Looking at the beloved community looks at taking care of people, even though they're not taking care of you or even considering you, especially when you're looking at the history of the AME church. You could see all these times when they took care of the men who were doing the ministry work, even though they could have been out there doing the same thing.
Right.
Right.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions in the Q&A?
Well, can I add, since Latanya talked about, the history of the AME Church, when we were putting this chapter together, we were noticing that women were out doing their thing, and then all of a sudden a man will come and do whatever. But the point I really want to make here, and she mentioned Bishop Henry McNeil Turner a couple of times in the presentation, as a man and as a person that's in the church and as a person that's in the academy, one of the things that I can do is to hopefully and prayerfully be in solidarity with women, listening and working together with women. And that's one of the things that a 19th century bishop was articulating back then. And I have suggested, because I've done this talk before, that we can learn a thing or two from Bishop Turner from the 19th century to bring it to the 21st century in order to move forward and to do the things that we are called to do.
Another thing I like to say is womanism is for everybody.
That's right.
It is for everyone. So I just want to say thank you to my special guests, our contributors for these beautiful chapters, well thought out, diversity of thought and application of womanism, and being able to provide a visual or a view of how others can use that theoretical framework of womanism to actually do the work, to do activism, to care for others, to make change in our social structure that we have going on right now out there. So everyone, thank you so much. I appreciate you. I just really enjoyed the contributions you made this evening. And I look forward to, we're going to be busy this year because there's been a lot of interest in this book. So I know we're going to do this. We're going to have these conversations again. I'm pretty sure we will be having a conversation with the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change. That'll be coming up, and I'll let you know when that gets scheduled. And if you're available, you're available, because I know you're all busy. But if not, I have more ammunition to articulate your chapters should the opportunity, and it is an opportunity, presents itself. It should someone have a question on it, I can say, I'm pretty sure that Dr. Meigs would say this. You can confirm that with her. You can read her chapter in her other works. You can do that, but that's how it works. I'm pretty sure Dr. Anderson would say this about language in the classroom, in educational achievement gap. So just being able to hear you articulate it, it gives me more agency and power to speak on your behalf when you're not available when it comes to this. So thank you all very much. I appreciate you, and have a wonderful evening. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.